Hello again, Bio 30s. Okay, so you should be into your excretion unit. What I'm going to do is try and do a general overview of the nephron. The nephron can be one of the more confusing topics of this unit, but it's just very important. Just kind of keep reading over your notes, make sure you understand the anatomy of the kidney and the nephron, and then just try and separate the components as to what happens in each different part. So I'm going to be doing a general overview, but it's very important that you are still reading through all of these notes very carefully. Okay, so let's just kind of take a general overlook here at where the nephron is. So if I'm looking here at my diagram of the kidney, all right, we know that the kidney has a renal pelvis, which is that component's there. There are the renal pyramids, which you're kind of sectioning off the layer of the cortex and the medulla here. There is the outer cortex area and the medulla, and each of these are also supplied by blood vessels. So blood goes into the kidney through the renal artery, then branches into smaller and smaller vessels, and then exits the kidney from the renal vein. So the nephron actually crosses the cortex and the medulla. So if I were to kind of draw where a nephron is, it would be kind of branching from the cortex and into the medulla as well. And whatever leaves the collecting duct then dumps into the renal pelvis. So it crosses both kind of borders between the cortex and medulla. Now let's keep in mind the nephrons are microscopic. So they're tiny. If you were to do a dissection of a kidney, you really wouldn't see these tiny working nephrons. All right, so when we're looking at a diagram of a nephron, we need to kind of understand the blood vessel supply and the nephron tubules. So after that renal artery kind of branches into smaller and smaller vessels, it's going to branch into an afferent arteriole. Okay, in biology, afferent essentially means coming to, efferent means going away. So this afferent arteriole brings blood into this bundle of capillaries called that glomerulus. All right. Then whatever is leaving the glomerulus goes through the efferent arteriole. Those branch into the peritubular capillary network. So these capillaries go all around that nephron, and we're going to talk about all the different kind of reabsorption and secretion that happens between the capillaries and the nephron. And then after, any blood kind of left over goes to the venule, and then to a vein, and then to the renal vein, and that's going to go back to the heart because it's kind of deoxygenated at this point and work its way through the circulatory system. So when we're talking about the connection here between the capillaries and the nephron, it's important that you know the nephron here is kind of Bowman's capsule, which surrounds the glomerulus. And then it goes into, I'm going to just be going in black here. So substances that leave the glomerulus, they leave the capillaries, they enter into Bowman's capsule. That would now be called filtrate. Okay. That filtrate is then now in the nephron. It goes through the proximal convoluted tubule, also shortened to just proximal tubule. It then dips into the loop of Henle. So the descending loop of Henle, then the ascending loop of Henle, then the distal convoluted tubule, and finally the collecting duct. Okay, so whatever filtrate kind of makes it through all the way through the nephron is then excreted in urine. But what we know is actually a lot of substances will get reabsorbed into those capillaries and stay within our body. Okay, that was just kind of a general overview. Now with the nephron, we need to remember here, there are kind of three very important phases, all right? First is filtration. So we know that the kidney's function is to filter all of our blood. All of our blood goes through our kidneys and through this kind of process, okay? All of our blood will in one way or another enter glomerular capillaries. It will be filtered where pretty well all of the substances except for blood cells and kind of large plasma proteins will enter into the nephron. Okay, that's the kind of filter process. Then we have reabsorption. So now that we kind of put all of our blood plasma into the nephron, we got to take back anything that we want that is valuable. So things like glucose and amino acids are returned back. Then we have secretion, which is actually taking substances from our blood and secreting it back into the nephron in order for it to be kind of secreted in our urine. The last step here is going to be the excretion, which is the actual removal of the urine. All right, let's move our way down here. I'm going to just do an overview of the kind of nephron components and what happens. So I'm skipping all those notes. You should have read them though. I added this picture. It was just kind of a bit more blank, and I will be writing on this. Okay. All right, so I've done my general overview. Let's get started here. Okay, so we've discussed blood coming to the kidney, goes through the renal artery into the afferent arteriole, where it's now in the glomerulus. What happens here in the glomerulus is filtration. What that means is basically all the plasma, essentially, so think back to blood components, the plasma is going to be pushed through the capillary walls into Bowman's capsule. That's kind of like filter. Think about like a strainer, right? Where you're pushing through some components and holding some back. The capillary walls almost act like the strainer. And because it's under very high blood pressure, almost everything is able to get through the capillary walls and into Bowman's capsule here, except for really large kind of molecules like the red blood cells, white blood cells, as well as large plasma proteins. Okay, so the plasma fluid passes through the capillaries into Bowman's capsule. Once it is in Bowman's capsule, whatever it is now is called filtrate. All right, so it's kind of the fluid. All right, so the blood then from the capillary level, it's going to leave the glomerulus, and now it's going to be the efferent arteriole. But all that's really in that blood at that point, for the most part, is going to be those remaining blood cells, large plasma proteins, and some other substances as well. Focusing here on the nephron a little bit. So that filtrate, which is pretty well, again, everything in our plasma, enters into the proximal convoluted tubule. So that's going to kind of be all of this section here. Okay. So in the proximal convoluted tubule, I'm going to shorten it to PCT, we have reabsorption. Now we're going to be reabsorbing. What this means, reabsorbing means that substances are going to go from the nephron back into the capillaries. Remember, anything we want to keep in our body needs to get back into our blood vessels. Anything we want our body to get rid of stays in the nephron, and we lose in our urine. So here we're going to reabsorb really important things like glucose and amino acids, and that's going to be almost 100% reabsorption of those things. So that's going to be a big job of the proximal convoluted tubule. We want to keep our glucose and we want to keep our amino acids. We're also going to be reabsorbing a bit of water and some salts, vitamins, things like that. Okay, those are the main ideas. Okay, so a bunch of substances have been reabsorbed from the proximal tubule back into those blood vessels. Whatever remains in the filtrate keeps going into the loop of Henle. Now, I'm just going to actually write on my diagram here. Remember, the nephron crosses the medulla and the cortex, and that's that barrier there. Okay, so the loop of Henle dips into the medulla. Here we have a descending limb and an ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Each of the sides of the loop of Henle actually have a different job, and they're kind of permeable to different substances. So the whole job of the loop of Henle is basically to kind of create a hypertonic medulla in order to stimulate more water reabsorption out of the nephron. So the ascending loop of Henle is actually impermeable to water, which means water actually cannot cross the barrier of the ascending loop of Henle. But what it does do is it's able to actively transport sodium and chloride ions. What this does is it creates a bit of a salt bath in the medulla, okay, and over here as well. What I mean by that is that the environment in the medulla is going to be hypertonic. What this does is it helps then water is going to be reabsorbed out of the descending limb in order to kind of follow the osmotic gradient. Okay, so the ascending limb helps create that hypertonic environment, and then the descending limb is permeable to water, and water is able to leave back into the medulla and then also back into the blood vessels. Okay, whatever's left over then goes into the distal convoluted tubule, just this kind of last section here. In the distal convoluted tubule, we are now going to have a little bit more reabsorption, but also mainly secretion. I'm going to try and write down here. Okay, so in this segment, sorry, this is going to be a bit messy. In the distal convoluted tubule, we have secretion of substances from the blood to the tubule. Okay, remember, whatever we want to keep in our body stays in our blood, and whatever we want to get rid of needs to stay in the nephron tubules. So some things like that would have been still left in the blood, possibly some toxins, are going to be secreted. There's also going to be other things like perhaps potassium ions or hydrogen ions to help maintain pH, some urea, and those are things that are going to be secreted from the blood into the tubule, okay, opposite direction of the proximal convoluted tubule. There still, however, is going to be some reabsorption which means moving substances from the tubule to the blood of maybe perhaps sodium and water. And you'll learn how the sodium reabsorption is controlled by hormones when you get to the negative feedback loop. Okay. Then we have the collecting duct. The collecting duct is kind of the last phase here of the nephron, where most of the job is about reabsorbing water and some urea, perhaps salts as well. Mainly water. Okay, the idea of the collecting duct is to do that final bit of fine tuning of the kind of filtrate in the urine. It's going to absorb water, reabsorb water so that we don't, pee out too dilute of urine. And it's also going to reabsorb some urea into the medulla. The reason it does that is just to kind of, again, keep working on that hypertonic environment to stimulate and promote that water reabsorption. Whatever's left in that collecting duct is urine. So in our urine, we're going to have urea, we're going to have water, we're going to have some toxins, and maybe some potassium and anything else left over. Okay. All right. Hopefully that was somewhat of a general overview, but make sure, again, you read your notes thoroughly.